So before looking at bigger models in later tutorials, I thought it would be worth looking at the kind of preferences I'm using, and also a few bits on the interface itself. So I suppose to start with, you can see obviously GSA on my screen now. For reference, that's the version I'm using, present build 27 of version 10.1. So tools, the tools menu in the top, if I come down there and go to preferences, basically that's setting the background information or the background settings that GSA is using. So I'm not going to go through everything, just the ones I think are key. I will point out, if you go to company info, this essentially is where you set the logo or the information to appear on the title block of the sheet which gets printed out. And of course you can choose the form of sheet if you go to page setup as well. Again, it's fairly easy to experiment with these if you do go to a print and a PDF. Tolerances, well, as it suggests, it's the kind of coincidence of the nodes when you define things. It's all fairly self-explanatory. But again, this might be of use to you or of interest if you're doing particular types of modeling. Units, there are various places to set this, but here is one of them. So you can choose the units that you're going to use. So I've chosen what I work with. I've got forces in kilonewtons. Large and small dimensions are set differently. Personally, I like stress in MPa. And there also are default data sets as well. If you go to section, well, that just simply pulls in where the steel sections come from. If you go to design, again, this is sets, or is one place to set the kind of background codes that GSA would use if you used it to do a codified design. Also the defaults for the kind of concrete grade and the reinforcement strength and the loading code as well. Again, I doubt I'll go into much of this in future videos, but it's just for reference really. Down here, again, it's very much how GSA displays things. Personally, I like to see my restraints being called up as kind of fixed or with X, Y, and Z, or ZZ, or XX, etc., shown. If you prefer actually to see restraint labels or symbols, you can kind of toggle that here. So, for example, on the screen behind this, you can see that it's got fixed for the encastry support. If I were to choose release labels and choose OK, nothing happens. Restraint labels, it should have been obviously. And you can see now it's got the kind of standard symbol for the encastry support. Personally, I don't like that. I just like to see the actual definition of what's been restrained. In the graphic settings, again, all fairly self-explanatory. You can look through these in your own time. It's basically just defining how the graphics are working. Sculpting, again, we'll come on to this in examples, but sculpting is basically modifying the model itself. And this bit, the box at the top here, is really how things get selected. So if you drag from right to left, everything gets selected. That's fully within the selection box. If you go in the opposite direction, it's only the parts. But again, you can experiment with that. Very much it's allowing you to set how you control GSA. Input, I'm not really going to say much about here. I don't really change anything here. In results, I personally would always have on decimal as the default. Personally, I like 3 decimal places, but you can kind of toggle that in the view itself. If you look in the toolbar at the top where I'm pointing now, you get the same kind of buttons that you see in Excel to toggle the decimal places. But by default, I would have decimal places at 3. I prefer that to scientific and engineering just because it's a kind of clearer output in terms of the way that I like to use GSA. If I go to miscellaneous, personally, I want to see all my error and warning messages so I can decide if they're important or not. So that's why I've got display all. Time backup, as I put on one of the slide that preceded this, saving and saving often is really important. Don't just rely on the time backup. Yes, I think GSA is very good. It's very stable, but still, it's good to save your work often manually to be sure that nothing ever gets lost. So that's really all I was going to say about that. Staying with the idea of preferences though, if we go to graphics in the toolbar, graphic settings, so again, various options here. The one I'm going to point out, the bit I'm pointing out, is this bit at the top, where we've got highlight edges, highlight coincidence nodes, shade surfaces, etc., etc. Personally, I like to have these checked, and what that does is graphically, it shows me edges in my model. So, for example, if things weren't tied up, if things weren't connected, it would highlight it. It's simply a visual way of helping me to understand what the model is actually showing me. Again, it's very much down to you whether you use that, but it's worth pointing out. The other one I think is quite important is if we go to Model, and then Data Modules, and then Specification, and then General. As you can see there, you can choose the units and the design code here as well. There are various ways of doing things in GSA, like most software packages, but I think it's a very well laid out piece of software, very well structured. But I'm going to go to, as I said, Model, Data Module, Specification, and General. And what I'm going to focus on is this bit here, the miscellaneous bit. So if you've got 2D elements, you can apply loads to the edges of the elements. So you can choose to either apply the load as a pressure, which is obviously then a function of the surface area of the edge, or force per length. Now, typically for us, it's going to be the force per length, and that's why I've kind of ticked that here. So you see there. So I'll come onto the interface in a bit. I've got a model here just to make it easier to show the various points that I'm going to make. But you can see along the edge of these elements, you've got the line load that you see defined there. On the gateway, which is this list on the left-hand side, if I were to go to Loading, 2D element loading, and edge loads, that's essentially kind of what, that's the elements that the loading is applied to. But you see at the top here, it's defining it as a force per length. And that then is basically a function of the preferences that we set. Obviously, you could apply it as an edge pressure, but that really isn't, well, I don't find that especially convenient. So one of the nice features that's been added fairly recently is we can customize the toolbars in GSA. So if you've got something that you do often that isn't on a toolbar, it's as with most software packages, you can click on the button at the end, click Add and Remove, and then you can choose Customize. And essentially, you've got the various commands within GSA here that you can just simply kind of drag on to the toolbar itself. So again, fairly straightforward. Again, if you've got something that you do often, it's worth adding it in. So for example, here, Add or Remove buttons. You can go through all of this. The one I'm looking for is Sculpt. So the one I'm looking for is Labels. So obviously labeling the model helps us, and I've kind of chosen to label the 2D edges, or to have that icon or button on the toolbar, and that's the one you see at the end there. So if I zoom into my model, you can see I've got a set of 2D elements to form the floor plate. We've got the kind of shrink button there, but you see the elements themselves, there's nothing on them. If I were to click this button, which is the label of the 2D element edges, you see the arrow on the edges of the elements itself. If I annotate it with the nodes, again, my annotation button's up here, what the edge arrow shows is the edges in GSA of a 2D element, say, are numbered from 1, 2, 3, 4. And essentially they go from node 1 to node 2, node 2 to node 3, node 3 to node 4. So that's a way of basically knowing which edge is which. And that becomes important because you can apply an edge load, say, to a 2D element, so you want to know which edge it's being applied to. So for example, if we go back to the edge loads I looked at earlier, you see in the middle column here, they can apply to edge 4. If I go back to the graphic view, turn back on the loading, and you can see there, so this is edge 1, edge 2, edge 3, and edge 4. So maybe just to take a step back on the discussion and to look at the toolbars themselves. Well, you've got the kind of standard toolbars along the top that you see in most software, like the save, the open, the print, print preview, etc., etc. Again, I'll just pick out the ones I think might be useful. The toggle dockable panes, so that basically, as the name suggests, toggles on and off the viewing panes. These are for carrying out the analysis. We'll look at that in the next tutorial. The button there is the wizard. So almost when you open up any dialog in GSA, whether that's to input nodes, loading, etc., material properties, etc., etc., if you're not sure what to do, often if you click the wizard, it'll give you a default dialog box based on what you're looking at the time. So we'll come to that a bit later. The 4 crosses there essentially allow you to toggle on and off these grid lines, and again I'll look at that later. These buttons there are scalped options, and again these are something we'll look at in a future tutorial. This is the edit list, so it remembers the last type of edit you did, whether it's moving and copying, whether it's splitting elements, and it automatically puts that to the top. So it's a shortcut way to kind of get to these options, which typically can be found in the scalp toolbar there. These buttons are annotation, so that switches on and off the nodes and the 2D elements, that numbers the nodes, that turns on and off the annotation for the restraints. This button, I think, is actually sort of one I use a lot. So you see on my beam sections, for example, it's got the kind of circle there, because if I turn on the kind of full section shape, it's essentially circular columns. And the reason I think that's quite nice to have switched on, and going back to the, well, we'll come to that in a second, sorry. I think it's nice to have that switched on because it just reminds me what the section shape is without having to have in the full thing shaded in. These are showing releases and element directions. Moving to the left-hand side, I've got my kind of format painter, my eyedropper there. My new graphic view option is there. So if I were to click that, I get a new graphic view essentially of exactly what I'm showing on the screen now. One interesting thing, one useful thing, is that if you press the format painter and then you press the new graphic view button, you'll get an exact copy of what's shown on the screen. So if I minimize that, you'll see that's my original view, and that's the one that was created. So if, as we'll look at later, you've excluded areas, you maybe annotated bits, and you want an exact copy of that screen, the way to do that is to select the format painter first. Underneath that is the output view, and again you can use this to get the results in tabular format or data on the nodes, the coordinates, etc., etc. If I click OK, you'll see I've chosen to get the coordinates off the nodes. So again, maybe I want to do something in Excel, but that's a way to do that. So that's clicking on the output settings there. Like a lot of the output in GSA, once you've chosen what you want, you can actually choose to output everything or to do subsets based on lists that you've defined, and I'll come on to defining lists in a second. Underneath that, well, the pencil essentially redraws or regenerates the view. Then below that, these are simply view settings to automatically turn the view around, zoom extents. Then the first 3 there are manipulating the view, so rotate, magnify. Again, it's all fairly standard stuff. The one I think is interesting though is this tool here, the small cube. That's essentially a volume box, or it isolates a volume. So if I were to click on that and then drag in one direction, it's essentially capturing or showing only what's inside the actual volume itself. So once maybe I've done that, I might want to go to the Format Painter and then create a new view now that I've isolated that. If you go back and select the volume again, if you right click, you can delete either the all volumes or the last volume. And the benefit of this is you can do volumes in succession, and GSA remembers that, so you can step back a single step as opposed to deleting everything. So by way of example, if I take another volume like that, so we only now see the column, if I right click, delete last volume, we come back to that, and delete last volume, we come back to the entire structure. Taking a volume again, delete all volumes, we come back to that. Sorry, I thought it would cancel there when I press escape. One of the good things that is implemented in GSA is the right-click drop-down options. It's got a huge amount of context sensitivity. So depending on what you're doing, often there's a way to get to a command quite easily by using the right-click option. So moving on underneath the volumes, these are essentially selection tools for nodes, for elements. That draws polylines, and that's a selection for annotation. So we'll come to annotation in a bit, but for example, if we clicked on that, so if I take off my annotation tool, if we click on that, maybe we choose an element to be annotated, and then that's what gets annotated. Sorry, I realized that last bit wasn't especially clear. I think perhaps it's because I don't have the model analyzed, that it's not annotating or selecting anything. Anyway, I'll come back to that shortly. Moving across to the other side, well, that's a shrink tool. Again, I recommend experimenting with this. The useful one's the third one down, which is the adornments or labeled display methods. So you can basically choose how you want the screen to display. You've got the axis, you've got various options on the nodes. So I like to have these on by default. So that's obviously I'm showing my restraints and supports, which are the fixed, and the other restraints. If I've got rigid constraints applied, I want to see those, which is why I've got that on by default. By default, I like to have on, as I said, the kind of section shapes, and that's what this is ticked for. So every time GSA starts up, it's going to remember these default settings. Other labeling, again, you can go through these as well. And there's a whole range of options to display or color elements by type, properties, and so on. And perhaps we'll look at those in a future session. I'll skip over these two for the moment and then come down. This is then the, again, annotation, quick annotation tools for displaying, as I showed you before, for loads, for deflections, for bending moment diagrams once you've analyzed your structure, and so on. If you only want to annotate a particular set of selected elements, that's the button you would press there. For 2D elements, and if I just quickly run the analysis for this. So these, again, are the output results. So for example, if I click on that, it gives me the kind of contour bar for the axial force in these columns. And there's only load in that because I've just got on the edge load. If I go to the self-weight case, you can see that. But the two at the bottom, X and Y, are essentially the bending moments in the 2D elements, and it's mx plus mxy or my plus mxy, as you can see there. Now, it's very useful to have these there by default. But the other way to get to that are the other two buttons here. So the first of those is the contouring that you've just seen. So you can contour both results, but also properties as well. So if you've got different material properties, you can contour those. Maybe you want to check that they're applied correctly. You can contour the loading as well. So for example, the 2D element loading, if I want to check what my face pressures are, so the loading onto the structure, if I go apply, you can see it's telling me that I've got the same load applied to the entire slab. That's not surprising in this case because, as you see there, it's a self-weight case. If I come back to that, I can go clear, apply, and it gets rid of everything. So it's all fairly self-explanatory. If you open these up, you can see what the options are. If I go to the 2D element results, again, you can see a whole range of options. You've got derived and projected results typically. Projected, essentially projected onto a face, the face you're looking at, is simply the kind of raw data. If you look at derived, that, as the name suggests, is derived data. So principal moments, for example, are derived, and you've got the kind of through thickness shear option in there as well. If I go to projected moments, the thing that the developers have added in here is an option to display mx plus mxy and my plus mxy. So hopefully you're familiar with the wood armor type rules or something similar, where you take the bending moments in an element, combine them to get the design moment. And this essentially is a quick and simple and conservative way to actually get that combination and display it. So again, that's quite helpful. But again, you can go through these in your own time. Again, it's all fairly self-explanatory. The colored icon was for contouring options. The one underneath is for diagramming. So perhaps the easiest way or easiest one to show you there. Again, lots of options. Again, you can go through these as well. They're all fairly self-explanatory. If I go to beam and spring forces and moments, if I look at axial force, for example, if I go to apply, you can see the line diagram, whereas before we had the color bar contouring. If I clear that and go OK. If I just go back though to the colored contouring, so that's the axial forces in the columns, you can see there in the menu in the legend, it's got axial force and the colors of the axial forces themselves. But you see it's got the 3 decimal places that we have in our preferences. If you come to the options there, you can get rid of the decimal places. Personally, I like that. It makes it easier to see. If you don't want the legend displayed for whatever reason, if you press Control, Alt, and L, you can toggle through it. So what we have on the screen just now, the legend would be printed and it can overlap the diagram itself. If you press Control, Alt and L again, it sets the legend in its own bar at the side, and when you print it, that's not going to overlap with the diagram. And if you press Control, Alt and L again, it gets rid of it completely. So again, maybe you want that in terms of your diagramming. But again, Control, Alt and L just kind of toggles through that. I would say that if you look for hotkeys in the GSA manual, it gives a whole list of these which you could find quite helpful. So if we get rid of the annotations, one way to do it would be to go back into the contouring option and into the contouring set. I can press that to get rid of it. Or we can come to the button there to rescale all data. To the one above it, to reset display adornments. That gives you the option to get rid of it. It's giving you a warning just to be sure you're not pressing it by mistake. The button I pressed on at first. So for example, if I turn on the diagramming for the bending moment diagrams, you can, if you wanted to scale it back and forth, if it's too big, you can auto scale it basically by the option there. If I turn that off now. The other adornment option I'll go through is here, where you've got this font option, although really it's a bit more than that. So you see my kind of layer is this kind of parchment type color. And in GSA, you've got the design layer and the analysis layer. We're in the analysis layer just now, and I'll talk about these a bit more in the next session. In the analysis layer, it's exactly the layer that you might work on or manipulate if you're looking at analysis. In the design layer, you can construct your models there and actually use some of the design features in GSA. So if you hold down again hotkeys Control Alt and D, you toggle between the design layer, which is this one here with the pink background, and pressing Control Alt D again back to the analysis layer. You see at the top it says analysis layer there and design layer there. Now I've turned this on that the screen itself changes color. By default, what you'd see is this. So by pressing Control Alt and D, I'm toggling between the layers, and the only real indication that you're on the analysis layer or the design layer is this bit at the top. You've got this small circle, or this colored circle of parchment and the pink color with A and D in it, and obviously, yes, the title's changing itself. But I don't find that especially clear. I much prefer to have the color background displayed. So this is the default that you would have when you start GSA for the first time. Personally, I would always go to that, choose color background by layer. So then it's really clear if you're on the analysis layer as here or the design layer as here. I just find it an easier way to work with GSA. So once you've got maybe your defaults all set up, you've maybe got an angle that you like to view the model in. How do you make GSA kind of remember that and start up with this all the time? So maybe I always want to start up with the elements in this kind of shrunk position. Perhaps I always want the node points to be shown. Perhaps I always want the node numbers to be turned on, although I personally wouldn't do that just because it makes the screen very cluttered. But say that's the kind of view I really like, and I want GSA to remember that. Well, if you right-click and you save default view settings, each time GSA starts, it should remember these are your default view settings, these are the view settings that you like, and that's how it'll start up each time. So again, it can save you a lot of time having to reset things up each time. So the final thing I'm going to talk about are groups and lists. So like most software packages, you can select elements and assign them to lists. So it's easy or easier to recall various selections. So for example, if I select those elements, you see the color because I've selected them. If I right click, and again this comes back to what I was saying before about, if I right click, so we can see the whole menu this time. This comes back to what I was saying before about the kind of context. You see there's many more options here now. So I can hide the elements. There's various other options, but the one I'm going to look at is save selection as list. So what comes up then? I've already got some lists defined, which is why this says list 7, but I would say so I'm going to call this a random selection, and if I click OK, if I hit escape to get rid of the selection. So what's happened there? Well, if I come again to the gateway view, I've got my lists here. You see, as I said, I've defined some lists already, and that's the one I've just added called random selection, and these are the elements which were selected. So what's the use of doing something like that? Well, you can see at the top, I didn't talk about this before, but if you look at cases, these are the analysis cases I've defined. I'll talk about these in a later tutorial. You can then display or choose to display nodes, elements, members, what have you. And then that's what you're displaying. And then this is the selection. So at the moment, I'm displaying all elements. But if you then click on that, you can see I've got my random selection list here. And if I click on that, it then takes me back to my random selection. I've defined some others. So I've got my slabs defined by bays. So I've exactly done the same thing before. I've selected the elements. I've right-click, save selection as list, and called it slab bay 1, bay 2, bay 3, bay 4, bay 5, and so on. If you hit all, you come back to that. You don't need to save lists to type anything in here. So again, if you look in the GSA help, it tells you how to define various types of elements. So 2D elements are area elements. So if you go PA, so property of area elements, and I type PA1, all of these elements have the same property. So for example, if I click on that element and I look in the right-hand side, it's grayed out just now because I've run the analysis, which I'll get rid of so it's easier to see. But you see I've got property 1, that element's property 1. So when you define elements, you give them properties, so that's the thickness, the material type, and that's how it's defined, so PA1. For stick elements, 1D elements, they're beam elements, so that would be property beam 1. And all my columns have exactly the same property. I could go PB1, PA1, and that shows me everything. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. So you can say something or type something like that. You can do not PB1, not PA1. So again, if you look in the manual in the help, it again helps you out with the syntax for all of that. The other way you can define an element is you've got the property, but also the group. So I mentioned that the properties are the material itself. So again, all of this is listed, or the gateway kind of contains all the data. If we go to properties, you've got section library, so that's the 1D elements defined here. If I click on that, that's my property. 1 is my columns. If I go to 2D elements, the property 1 for 2D elements is the slab I've defined there. But you can also give elements a group name or number. So again, it's another way of defining or referencing the element itself. So you can apply loads when we come to that. Well, I'll look at it now actually. So face loads. I've applied the loading to these lists. So you see that's the lists I've created already. That's the random selection list. So I'm applying this loading case, which I'll look at in the next tutorial, to these elements. Equally, I could type 1 there, just hit return. And what that's doing is I'm applying the self-weight case to element 1. But again, I'll come back to that in a bit. But equally, that's applying it to the element number. So if we zoom into this, I think if we label the elements, we can see that's element 276 actually. But equally, you can apply loading to groups. So for example, if I selected these elements, call them group 10, and then hit return. So that doesn't really help us much because we can't really see that. You remember the label display. We want to color the elements by group. If I hit apply and go OK there, you can see it's colored it by default. So you've got one set of elements with one grouping and one here. If I filled it in, you would see the red elements and the blue ones. If I come to there, if I click this element, you see it's group 10. If I click the blue element, you see it's group 1. In the same way, we can come back to the top. We can go G10, and all we'll see is the group 10 elements. Similarly, we could go G1, and all we would see is the group 1 elements. If I click all to get out of that. Just by way of example to show the loading, well, actually, no, I'll go to lists. So I've got my list dialog here. Again, you could press the wizard, and that would give you a dialog for that. So I'll cancel that. But let's type list. So the list is based on the group. It's a list of elements. And if I put G10, G10, sorry, I hadn't typed element there. So what that should do is it'll associate all the elements in group 10 with this list name. So if I close that, I should see here list based on group. If I click that, it gives me group 10. But what I wanted to show you is that if you then come back to the loading, face loads, you've then got list based on group there. If I were to say that's, let's say load case 5, again I'll come back to load cases. If I just put in a random loading onto that, if I then annotate the load, so on the right hand side you've got the apply load or show the load diagram. If I go to list load 5, which is what I assigned it to, you can see the loading is only applied to those elements. So I'll come back to this and look at it in more detail when I look at the that's a modeling example I'm going to do next. But as you can see, there's a whole range of ways of defining and listing elements, and it's a really powerful way of isolating and recording and applying loads and basically working with the analysis model. So the final thing I want to look at is, if I take off the annotations, is how to save a view. So for example, we've got our slab there, so perhaps we're looking at it from above. So maybe we want to save this as a view so we can always recall it with the annotations that are on it and save it as part of the model. So again, if we right click, we've got the option here to save the graphic view. And you can type a name in there. And I've got a few of these defined already, so, well, I'll show you that. Plan view test. So if I come back to the gateway, if I come across and go to views, you've got saved graphic views here. If I just close the one I have on the screen, no, I don't want to do that. Let's see. If I've got come back, to the views, saved graphic views, plan view test, it basically gives me a view of the view I've saved. The one I had on the screen before that is still there. Sorry, the one I have had on the screen before that is still there. I double-clicked it. So why might that be of use? Well, let me just reanalyze the model quickly. So I've actually saved a series of views already. And the way I might work with GSA is to have perhaps a series of views open at the same time. So going back to the idea of hotkeys, one of the other useful hotkey combinations is that if you press Control and then press the keys on the number pad on the keyboard, that then moves the view to different positions. So I'm just holding down Control and pressing 4, so that does that. Press 6, that moves it across, and so on. Pressing 5 takes it back to that. But let me just do Control and 4 for that. So that's essentially the base model I have. But you see, I've also saved views called hogging and sagging. So if I click on sagging, I get that. If I click on hogging, I get that. So I saved these when the menu bars were hidden. So if I click on toggle dockable panes, I get that. If I go to this view and press Control and 4, it gives me that. I'm not too sure why that's not on the screen, but if I do that, there we go. So again, it really helps to have saved views that you can recall. So for example, here, I've got my analysis model on the left-hand side. I've got my sagging moments on the right, the hogging moments on the lower right. And that just really helps me to basically keep track of what's happening. Obviously, you can set up the views however you want. But using save views and just using the control and the number pad to move them about really does help you to organize the screen itself. The other really good thing about save views is that I've defined these contouring values. So it remembers the contouring. So even if I were to make changes to the model, it's remembering the contouring. And to me, that's important because I like to have a constant sort of reference set of contours. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but if I went to the contouring option again on the right-hand side of the screen, you can control how you want to contour things. If you choose specify, you can see here I've typed in the contours I want to display. So when you save a graphic view, it's also saving the contouring that you've put in. So again, it's a really powerful way of organizing your model and making things much quicker to do in terms of the analysis itself. So that's been a really quick run through of the interface in GSA and some of the preferences I use. Really, there's no better way to get accustomed to it than just going through the options and seeing how it works for yourselves. But I hope that this at least gives context to what we'll be seeing in terms of my setup when I look at GSA in the next example that I'm going to look at in terms of constructing an entire building model. So I hope that's useful. Thank you.